We finally made it. The moving truck was gone. Our boxes were stacked in every corner, and Mark was already talking about where to put the couch. The house was old but in good shape. Tall ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and way too much space for just the three of us. Danny, our 6-year-old, was unusually quiet. Normally, he'd be running around, checking out every room, but instead, he just stood near the staircase, staring up at the second floor. "Hey, bud," I said, kneeling next to him. "What do you think? Pretty cool house, huh?" Danny blinked slowly and nodded, but he still didn't move. "Do you want to pick out your room?" That got him going. He ran upstairs without another word. I laughed, shaking my head, but something about the way he had been standing there, so still, so focused, bothered me. The rest of the day was a blur of unpacking. By the time we finally settled down for dinner, the house felt more like ours. But as the sun started to set, the atmosphere shifted. It was subtle at first, just a heaviness in the air, like the house itself was holding its breath. Mark was exhausted, sprawled out on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Danny sat across from him, absent-mindedly pushing his food around his plate. I was washing dishes when I heard it. A creak. Not unusual in an old house, except this one wasn't coming from the walls or floors. It was upstairs, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I froze, gripping the edge of the sink. "Mark," I whispered. He barely looked up. I waited, listening, but the sound was gone. Maybe I had imagined it. "Nothing," I muttered, drying my hands. That night, after tucking Danny in, I crawled into bed next to Mark. The exhaustion hit me like a wave, but just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. Creak. This time it was closer. I turned over, nudging Mark. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. "It's an old house, babe. Go to sleep." I tried, but the moment my eyes shut, I felt it. A presence. Not a noise this time, not a creak or a whisper. Just the unmistakable feeling that something was standing in the doorway, watching. I held my breath, forcing myself to stay still. The air felt heavier, pressing down on my chest. Then, from down the hall, Danny's room. A giggle. Soft. Light. It made my skin crawl. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. Danny was laughing? At this hour? I slipped out of bed and crept to his room. The door was slightly open, and through the crack, I saw him sitting up in bed, smiling at the corner of the room, talking. Not in words, just soft murmurs, like a kid whispering a secret. My stomach twisted. "Danny?" I pushed the door open. He stopped talking immediately, his head snapping toward me. He blinked a few times, like he was waking from a dream. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. He looked at the empty corner of his room, then back at me. "My new friend." I felt a chill run through me. "There's no one there, sweetheart." He frowned, looking genuinely confused. "Yeah, there is." I swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Well, it's bedtime. Tell your friend goodnight, okay?" Danny hesitated before whispering toward the corner. "Good night." I tucked him in, kissed his forehead, and turned off the light. But as I closed the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, I convinced myself it had just been Danny's imagination. Kids make up imaginary friends all the time. That's normal. But as the day went on, the house started feeling less like ours and more like we were intruding. It was little things at first. I woke up early to make coffee, only to find all the dining chairs pulled out from the table. Every single one. Mark was still in bed, and Danny was barely awake, rubbing his eyes in the doorway. "Did you do this?" I asked. Danny shook his head. "No." I pushed the chairs back in, telling myself maybe I had forgotten to do it the night before. But then it happened again. I turned away for a second to grab the sugar, and when I turned back, one of the chairs was pulled out again. I stood there, frozen, staring at it. Mark walked in, yawning. "What's up?" I pointed at the chair. It just moved. He gave me a look like I was crazy. Lisa, it's early. I didn't push it. Maybe I had imagined it. The rest of the day passed without anything strange. Mark went to work, Danny played in his room, and I focused on unpacking. But as the sun started to set, the air in the house changed again. I was folding clothes in our bedroom when I heard the television turn on downstairs. A loud burst of static. I frowned, heading down to turn it off. The remote was on the coffee table, untouched. The TV screen flickered, the static shifting into an old black and white show. It looked ancient, like something from the 50s, but there was no sound. Just the image of a living room, empty, quiet. I grabbed the remote and shut it off. Before I could turn around, a soft click echoed from the hallway. The basement door. It was open. I stared at it, my chest tightening. We hadn't even gone down there yet. The real estate agent had barely mentioned it, just said there was nothing but old storage space. The door swung slightly, like it had just been nudged open. I stepped forward, peering down the stairs. The basement was pitch black, a solid wall of darkness. Something moved, not a sound, not a shape, just a shift in the darkness, like something had pulled back into the shadows. I slammed the door shut. I didn't go down there. That night, Danny wouldn't sleep in his room. He stood in the hallway, clutching his stuffed bear, his lower lip trembling. "What's wrong, buddy?" Mark asked, crouching down to him. Danny didn't answer right away. Then, in a small voice, he whispered, "My friend doesn't like when you're around." Mark and I exchanged a look. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. Danny rubbed his eyes. "He says you shouldn't be here." My stomach dropped. Mark forced a chuckle. "Well, we're not going anywhere, so your friend will just have to get used to us." Danny didn't laugh. I let him sleep in our bed that night. At around 2 a.m., I woke up to whispering. It wasn't coming from Danny. It wasn't coming from Mark. The baby monitor on the nightstand was on. Soft static crackled from the speaker, followed by a low, hushed voice. Too deep to be Danny's. I sat up, my heart hammering. The whispering stopped. Silence. Then, right before I turned it off, a slow, deliberate breath, like someone was standing right next to the monitor, listening. The next morning, I didn't mention the baby monitor to Mark. He already thought I was imagining things, and maybe I was just exhausted. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched never left me. It followed me through every room, like something unseen was just out of sight, waiting. I decided to do something about it. That afternoon, while Mark was at work and Danny was napping, I set up my phone to record the house. Just a quick video, something to prove to myself that nothing was actually happening. I started in the living room, scanning the empty space. The TV was off. The dining chairs were where they should be. Everything looked normal. I moved to the hallway, pausing at the basement door. It was still shut. Finally, I walked upstairs, stopping at Danny's room. The door was cracked open. I pushed it wider, stepping inside. Danny was curled up in bed, breathing softly. Everything was fine, but when I played back the video later, my stomach turned. At first, it looked exactly the same as when I recorded it. The living room, the hallway, the basement door. Then I reached Danny's room. I watched myself push the door open, stepping inside. And just as the camera moved past the closet, something shifted. A dark shape, just for a second, barely visible, like something had been standing inside the closet, just out of sight, and pulled back the moment I stepped in. I dropped my phone, my hand shaking. I wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, but I knew what I saw. That night, Mark set up cameras, not because he believed me, but because he thought it would make me feel better. One in the living room, one in the hallway, and one in Danny's room, facing his bed. We went to sleep, the quiet hum of the cameras the only sound in the house. At 3 a.m., I woke up, Not because of a noise, not because of movement, but because something felt wrong. I turned my head slowly, my breath catching in my throat. Danny was standing in our doorway, not moving, just staring. I sat up, my pulse pounding. Danny, he didn't answer. His eyes were open, but they looked strange, unfocused, like he wasn't really there. Mark groaned beside me, rubbing his face. Buddy, what are you doing? Still, no response. Then, in the quiet, Danny whispered something. At first, I thought I misheard. Then he said it again. He's in the walls. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Mark sat up, groggy. What? Danny blinked slowly, then turned and walked away. Just like that, I scrambled out of bed, following him back to his room. But by the time I got there, he was already curled up in bed, sound asleep, like nothing had happened. The next morning, I checked the cameras. The living room, nothing. The hallway, nothing. Then I pulled up Danny's room. For a long time, the footage was normal. Just Danny, sleeping peacefully. Then, at 3 a.m., he sat up. His movements were slow, unnatural, like he was being pulled upright. His head turned toward the closet, and for a second, just a second, I saw it. The closet door opened a crack. Not fast, not sudden, just enough. And in the darkness inside, two pale fingers curled around the edge of the door. Holding it open, I slammed the laptop shut. I couldn't breathe. Something was in this house with us. I didn't tell Mark right away. I knew what he would say. It's just shadows, just tricks of the light. You're overthinking it. But I had seen it. I had seen the fingers. And Danny was changing. He was quieter, more distant. He barely played with his toys anymore, just sat in his room, staring at the walls like he was waiting for something. Or someone. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak in the house sent my heart racing. Mark, of course, was out cold beside me. I kept staring at the open bedroom door, half expecting Danny to show up again, standing there with his blank stare. At some point, exhaustion won. I closed my eyes, and then I felt it. Not a sound, not a movement, just pressure. Something was pressing down on my chest. I gasped, my eyes flying open. My body wouldn't move. I could see the ceiling, the dim light from the hallway, but I couldn't sit up, couldn't breathe. The weight pressed harder. It wasn't like hands. It wasn't like anything touching me. It was like the air itself was pushing me down. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I tried to move, tried to scream, but nothing came out. And then, right beside me, a whisper. Not words, not a voice, just a breath. Slow, long, like something was inches from my face, leaning in, letting me know it was there. Then all at once the pressure lifted. I shot up, gasping for air. The room was empty. Mark was still asleep. Everything was normal, but I knew it wasn't. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there in the dark, listening, waiting, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. I didn't, because the next morning, Danny wouldn't look at me. He sat at the breakfast table, pushing his cereal around, his little hands limp at his sides. His eyes were ringed with dark circles, his skin too pale. Danny? I knelt beside him. Are you okay, sweetheart? He nodded. Did you sleep okay? He didn't answer. Instead, he picked up his spoon, dug it into his cereal, and whispered, He's mad at you. I felt the hair on my arms rise. Mark frowned, looking up from his phone. Who's mad? Danny kept his eyes down. My friend. I swallowed, keeping my voice calm. Why is he mad? Danny finally looked up at me, and in the morning light, I swear, just for a second, his eyes didn't look like his. They were darker, wrong, and then he blinked, and it was gone. He shrugged. He doesn't like when you ask questions. Mark let out an awkward laugh. Okay, buddy, that's enough creepy talk this morning. But I wasn't laughing, because something deep in my gut told me this wasn't a game. Something was mad at me, and it was only getting worse. I couldn't stay in that house another day without knowing what was going on. While Mark was at work and Danny was at school, I sat down with my laptop and started digging. I searched everything: the history of the house, past owners, anything that might explain why I felt like we weren't alone. At first, nothing. No deaths, no crimes, no tragic past that would explain why the air felt heavier every day, why Danny was changing, why I was waking up in the middle of the night with something pressing down on me. But then I found something. It was buried deep in an old forum, just a passing comment on a local history page. That house, no one stays there long. Families move in, and within a year, they're gone. No reason, no explanation. Just leave everything behind. I kept digging, searching the names of previous owners. Most of them had sold the house at a loss, barely staying longer than a few months. One name stood out: a woman named Claire Madison. She had lived there 15 years ago. I searched for her on social media, expecting nothing. But I found her. A private profile, a blurry photo. I hesitated. Then I sent a message. "Hi, my name is Lisa. My family just moved into your old house. I was wondering if you could tell me why you left." I didn't expect a response, but an hour later, my phone buzzed. One new message: "Claire Madison, get out." That was it. I stared at the screen, my hands clammy. I typed back quickly. "What happened?" She was typing. Then she stopped. Then she started again. Finally, the message came through. "It doesn't want you there. We try to stay. We tried to ignore it. But the house, it doesn't let you ignore it for long." I swallowed hard, my fingers shaking as I typed. "What do you mean?" This time, her response was almost instant. "It starts small. The noises, the shadows, the feeling of something watching you. But it doesn't stop. It wants you scared. It wants you weak. And if you don't leave, it gets worse." I felt sick. What happens if we don't leave? She took longer to reply this time. "You don't leave. At least, not the way you want to." My breath hitched. I needed more. I needed to know what was in this house, what it wanted. I typed, "What is it?" Claire's response came instantly. "Don't ask. Just go." And then, blocked. I sat there, staring at my screen. That night, I told Mark everything. I told him about the baby monitor, the closet door, the pressure on my chest, Claire's messages. I expected him to brush it off, to tell me I was being paranoid. But for the first time, he didn't. He was quiet, too quiet. Then he got up, walked to the hallway, and pulled up the camera footage from the night before. I hadn't checked it yet. He clicked on Danny's room, fast-forwarded to 3 a.m., and we both saw it. Danny, sitting up in bed, staring straight ahead, not moving. Then, the closet door creaked open. Slow, deliberate. Danny turned his head toward it. And then, from the shadows inside, a hand, not a normal hand, too long, too thin, fingers stretching out toward him. Danny didn't move, didn't react, just sat there. Then, after a few seconds, the hand pulled back. The closet door shut on its own. Danny lay back down like nothing happened. The video ended. I covered my mouth, barely holding back a sob. Mark exhaled slowly, his face pale. "We need to get out of here." And for the first time, I knew he believed me. The next morning, we decided we were leaving. No more excuses. No more waiting. We were done. Mark called a realtor to list the house. I started packing. It didn't matter if we had just moved in. It didn't matter if we lost money. None of it mattered anymore. But the house didn't like that. The moment we decided to leave, everything got worse. It started small. Our car keys vanished. We searched everywhere. Every drawer, every pocket, every inch of the house. Nothing. Mark swore he left them on the kitchen counter the night before, but they were gone. Then, The power went out. Not the whole neighborhood, just our house. Mark checked the breaker box, but everything was fine. No reason for it. The lights just wouldn't turn back on. The house was silent. Too silent. Danny sat on the couch, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the blank television screen. I sat beside him, running my fingers through his hair. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured. He didn't respond. I tried again. "Hey, bud, want to help me pack your toys?" Danny turned his head slowly and looked at me. And in the dim light, I swore his face wasn't his for a second. Something was behind his eyes. Something else. I flinched back, my breath catching in my throat. Then he blinked. Just like that, he was Danny again. He smiled. "Okay, Mommy." I felt sick. I didn't know what to do. Mark came back inside, shaking his head. "Power's fine. I don't know what's going on." I grabbed his arm, my voice low. "We need to go. Now. Tonight." He nodded. "I'll call a locksmith, get new car keys made." But before he could grab his phone, Danny started screaming. I spun around. He was standing in the middle of the living room, his face twisted in terror, his tiny hands clutched to his ears. "Make it stop," he screamed. I ran to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Danny, what's wrong?" He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently. "They're too loud." "There's nothing there, baby," I whispered. He sobbed. "They're in the walls. They don't want us to go." And then, as if the house itself had heard him, a deep, scraping sound echoed through the room. Inside the walls. Slow, deliberate. Something was moving. Mark grabbed my arm. "We're leaving." I didn't argue. We ran upstairs, grabbing only what we needed. Bags, clothes, our phones. Danny stayed close, trembling, his little hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. We made it to the front door. Mark twisted the knob. It wouldn't open. Locked. I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Unlock it." I did. He twisted the deadbolt. Nothing. I grabbed the knob, yanking with all my strength. It didn't budge. Then, bang, a deafening crash from upstairs. Like something heavy had fallen. Danny whimpered, hiding behind me. Mark turned, his face pale. "We need to go. Now." I ran for the back door. Same thing. Locked. Wouldn't move. Every exit. Every way out. The house wasn't letting us leave. Mark's breathing turned ragged. His eyes darted around, his hands shaking. "We break a window," I said. "We get out." He nodded. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a lamp, and hurled it at the living room window. The glass shattered. Mark lifted Danny into his arms. "Go. Now." I climbed out first, reaching up to help pull Danny through. And as I did, I felt it, a breath. Not from Danny. From behind me. Cold. Close. A whisper against my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I yanked Danny through the window and bolted. Mark jumped out right after us. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. The doors were unlocked. The keys, right there on the driver's seat. Mark didn't question it. He started the engine. I looked back at the house one last time. The windows were dark, empty. But as we drove away, I could feel it. It was still watching. Whoa, how do you feel about this story? Submit your creepy encounters to our email. You can find it in bio. Thanks for watching, and be aware of darkness.